Chapter 5 The Border Patrol. The life of a forest ranger was a lot like that of a sheep herder. All I had were my dogs and my horse. If I wanted company, I had to ride up to see Lynch and his mestizo kids. After a year of this good sport, I succumbed to the glowing reports from my amigo Parker, who was having a hell of a good time in the Border Patrol. He was into a gunfight every week, and sometimes two. This was in the days of the Great Depression, and also the time of that ill-fated attempt to force the thirsty American public to give up John Barleycorn. It was referred to as Prohibition, and was engineered by the national law called the Volstead Act. At any rate, there was a small influx of illegal Mexicans across the turbulent old Rio Grande, and a tremendous infusion of illegal spirits. Of course, this alcohol had to be transported, and with tens of thousands of campesinos just across the frontier, the problem of finding cargadores was small indeed. The liquor runners, they were called rum runners along the East Coast in those days, but we referred to them as contrabanditas, or smugglers, were doing a prospering business. The jefe, or head contrabandista, would go into the wholesale stores on the Mexican side of the border, and there could buy a quart of bourbon for $1.25, and he'd stock up with enough so that it would take a dozen cargadores to pack his load across the Rio Grande. The river was only thigh deep and not very wide, like 40 yards of water. There was a handy screen of willows on either bank, and guarded by maybe 6 pistoleros, he'd run his liquor across just as the shades of darkness commenced to fall. This was Parker's sport. He'd be waiting in the willows on the American side, and with a little luck and more generally after getting directions from an informer, he and his partner would knock off the gang, not usually without a lively fight in which a guard or two would get his mortal comeuppance. Despite the casualties on the Mexican side, the liquor kept right on coming. There was no marijuana smuggled in those days, and very little drug traffic. The cocaine that was smuggled into the United States mostly came over the international bridge between Juarez and El Paso on the Texas side. It was usually by auto and did not concern the Border Patrol. We were entirely occupied with aliens who attempted to enter without passport, and with the demon rum. Parker painted a rosy picture of the action, and, as I had taken the entrance examination a year before, when word finally reached me up on the vaqueros that I had been appointed to the patrol, I upped stakes and journeyed off to El Paso. By this time, old Buddy Parker had transferred to Tucson, Arizona. He is a native Arizonan, so it was not unexpected that he'd want to get back to his home stomping grounds. I went over to see him briefly before I reported for duty at El Paso. We took a couple days off, and in the company with Harry Renshaw, knocked off a Coos whitetail buck. Of course, it was out of season, but in those days, seasons were made to be ignored. Parker killed the little buck at more than 300 yards as it skimmed along up a side hill in the Canela Hills. It was an impressive shot, and I was frankly amazed. Henry Renshaw, who had been our team captain on the winning 8th Corps area rifle team, went on the next year to shoot on the U.S. rifle team in the world matches at Antwerp. He won the free rifle competition of the world. Renshaw became an Air Corps pilot, and during World War II was killed in the Pacific. He was a colonel at the time, and had he lived, so remarkable a fellow he was that I believe he might very well have become the Chief of Staff of the Air Force. At any rate, my days with this captivating duo came to an end, and I reported to the Chief, U.S. Border Patrol, El Paso. The chief was a hard-as-nails old combat veteran named Horsley. He had attained the rank of lieutenant colonel during World War I, had been through the Meuse-Argonne offensive in 1918 and 19, and was an ideal leader for the little band of the hard-bitten patrol officers who made up the force in the El Paso subdistrict. In those days, there was no training school for recruits. Indeed, the only recruit was myself. I was handed a badge, and since I had my own shooting irons, I did not draw the old .45 Colt Model 1917, or one of the next to worthless Enfield rifles. Likewise, there was no uniform, although the patrol had a uniform. You were on 6 months probation, and it was a waste of money to purchase a dress suit, which maybe at the end of the trial period you'd find you did not need. I went on duty at 4 p.m. in a pair of canvas pants and a canvas short jacket. Parker had shipped me a Sam Myers holster for the old 45 auto, and I had a slip-on series of cartridge loops for the rifle rounds. I had by this time set the old Model 95 in the corner and taken up the Savage Model 99 in 25300 caliber. I was ready when the team of which I was a brand new member took to the river. Border Patrol headquarters sat directly on the Rio Grande within a block of the main bridge between the Mexican town of Juarez and El Paso, the Texas Pueblo. The headquarters had been an old military police station and consisted of 3 brick barracks plus a mess hall. The middle barracks had been converted into the offices, and overhead is a 2-story affair where sleeping quarters for single officers. There was a repair garage in the northernmost barracks, which had been restructured for that purpose, and on the top floor a mess hall. This kitchen was still managed by the MPs, and it was here I ate, for $15 monthly, believe it or not. My first tour of duty, which ran from 4 in the afternoon until midnight, was a real treat. At 9:30 of the night, we were trudging up the trail from Monument No. 1 west toward the top of the little mountains just west of the El Paso smelter. At dusk, Jack Thomas and Tom Isbell had run into an ambush and killed a smuggler. There were 10 smugglers in the ambush. The patrol officers had shot it out with the gang. The U.S. Commissioner was pretty adamant about fetching in the dead ones, so the team of which I was a brand new member was toiling up the mountain, burro in tow, and once we reached the contrabandista, we draped him over the jackass and toted him back down to the smelter. I was enthralled, I'll tell you. I hadn't fired a shot, but I'd been close to the smell of gunpowder, and I thought, boy, this is for me. In those days, you got off only one Sunday each month. The duty entailed 7 days weekly, 29 days monthly. The patrolmen who were on the blacklist got all the night duty, they and the recruits. I either worked from 4 p.m. to 12 midnight in the first part of the night, or from 11 p.m. to 7 a.m. on what has always been universally referred to as a graveyard shift. I didn't mind. I was quite able to sleep in the daylight, and with a conscience as free and unburdened as only a blithesome spirit can be, I worked all night and slept for 4 or 5 hours during the day. It beat the vaqueros all to hell, I'll tell you. If we went to duty at 4 in the afternoon, we loaded up in an old Chevrolet sedan, and with rifles between our legs and 6 shooters at the hip, toured the Mexican side of town. The Border Patrol was only 6 years of age when I joined up, and there was a hell of a lot of Hefes did not know. In the beginning, there had been an attempt to put patrolmen off in pairs, but after any number of these jaspers had bumped into gangs which numbered 20 smugglers or more, they found they were a trifle outnumbered, especially when maybe half the Mexican contrabanditas were armed with pistolas. So the teams were reorganized, and by the time I joined up, consisted of 3-man squads. There were no radios, no contact with the headquarters, and if you got engaged with 40 smugglers, you simply stood up and shot it out with them. The hope of getting reinforcements was nil. You were completely and entirely on your own. El Paso had a police force, and there was a sheriff's office, but no Texas Rangers. The cops kept entirely and completely out of that portion of El Paso which lay along the Rio Grande. They wanted no part of it. The area was entirely that of Border Patrol. There was another Border Patrol along the Rio Grande, which belonged to the U.S. Customs. They patrolled the river just as we did. But because of a series of mix-ups in which the BP had shot it out with the Customs, the river was strictly divided. We did not invade their territory, and they were supposed to stay out of our district. This did not always work, and sometimes the Customs came into our section, and one occasion, which I well remember, it caused an exchange of shots at exceedingly close range. Within the patrol, areas were allotted to the teams as they left the headquarters. These areas lay along the river, and there was a sort of haphazard overlappings of spots, so all the better-known crossings were covered during the night. My team simply cruised around in Mexican town until it got dark, and then parked the old sedan and moved into the willows beside the river. The lights of Juarez shone on the water, and any gang of smugglers who elected to cross were nicely silhouetted by the illumination. During the daylight hours before moving into ambush, we kept a sharp lookout for campesinos who were wandering about the streets. Actually, the primary job of the Border Patrol was not alcohol at all, but illegal aliens. The BP was part of the Immigration Service and, believe it or not, was part of the Department of Labor. Our boss was an old maid named Frances Perkins, the first woman to hold a cabinet post. She had been appointed by Franklin Delano and was about as helpful as a black politician at the Ku Klux rally. But for all that, we were constantly on the lookout for wetbacks who had waded the Rio Grande and were footloose in El Paso. If we picked up a likely suspect, we grilled him. If he admitted he had just waded the Rio, we hauled him off to BP headquarters where he was fingerprinted, written up, and slammed in Old Stony Lonesome. We'd then go back to our assigned area along the river, and with the shades of night fallen, take up a likely position along the levee or on the riverside where the willows grew rank and profuse. My Spanish was next to nil, despite the fact that I'd been a year among the Pecinos in northern New Mexico. All of them spoke some English, and for that reason I had been dilatory indeed about trying to pick up the language. I very shortly enrolled in a Spanish course at the vocational training school, but the old dame who taught it was a gringa, and I have later suspected her knowledge of the language was pretty sketchy. At any rate, I listened and picked up a few pat phrases from other patrolmen. I was really in favor of banging a suspect over the ears with a six-shooter and then asking him if he'd crossed out of Mexico. This, I found, reduced the small talk to a few syllables and got a confession in short order. Some officers were in favor of this method. Others, mostly those jazzbos who had not been raised along the border, were not too happy with this system. Lying on the Rio Grande, the third night I was on duty, I looked across the piddling little stream, almost dry and not more than 50 feet in width, and saw 6 hombres loaded on their back steps into the water. These contrabanditas were packing not bottled goods, but alcohol in 4.5-gallon cans. This was a common item for illegal crossing. The recipients on this side proceeded to cut the alcohol and mix it with various flavoring substances to produce gin, which defied the most educated taste. At any rate, the tins gave off a pleasant gurgling sound and snapped and clattered as the cargadores waded the border stream. In charge of the BP team that night was a tough old outlaw named Robin Stafford. He'd just as soon shoot a smuggler as to ask him the time of day. As we jogged up through the willows, I knew somehow that the time for powder burning was upon us. We kept the smugglers in view, and were about to meet them on the bank when some son of a bitch took a shot at the 3 of us from this side. He was, most probably, the guide who would direct the cargadores to a waiting auto or into one of the shacks which virtually lined the American banks. On the shot which cut the willows about our heads, Stafford opened up with a dinky little Model 92 Winchester 4440. That was all the excuse I needed, but instead of shooting at the sound of the shot, I turned my attention to the Mexicans who were still 20 feet or so from the bank. I shot 3 shots as fast as I could work the lever on the savage. Liquor loads showered down into the turgid waters of the old Rio Grande, and some cargadores fell too. Whether they were hit or just scared and attempting to lie down in the thigh-deep water, I could not tell. It was such great sport that I pumped a couple of more rounds into the struggling mass in the water. The guarda, who had been awaiting his liquor and had shot once at us, never fired again. He melted back into the shadows and took refuge in the nearby shacks. We waded into the water. It was March and not too cold, and started in retrieving the alcohol. There were a dozen cans. If any Mexicans had been hit, we never asked. Indeed, those who had scrambled about in the water had apparently gotten to their feet and hightailed it for the Juarez side of the river. At breakfast the next morning, the senior inspector who had the graveyard shift in the office told me they pulled a dead Mexican out of the river near the Socorro head gates this morning. He'd been shot with a rifle. We got word from the American consul in Juarez. I was pretty. The Border Patrol had the Mex border divided into districts, and these major units were then subdivided into subdistricts. In each sub-district was a chief patrol inspector, and under him were ordinary patrol officers and senior patrol officers. In the El Paso subdistrict, which extended for 100 miles into the westward and for 85 miles to the east, were 42 officers. In the entire service, to include all the Mexican border, the whole of the Canadian frontier, and the state of Florida, there were but 600 officers. Today, the Border Patrol has a force of 6,000. In the El Paso subdistrict alone, during a 10-year period from 1924 to 34, there was an average of a gunfight every 17 days. There was never a good count on the number of smugglers who got shuffled off this mortal coil, but in round numbers it was in the neighborhood of 500. It was hard to count the dead ones, for oftentimes they managed to get into the house of amigos on this side and there died, or they crippled back across the Rio Grande and cashed in their chips in the land of manna. But anyway, 500 was a pretty good tally. That was an average of one dead smuggler every week for the whole period. The Border Patrol did not escape scot-free. There were 23 deaths and an uncounted number of wounded. I say uncounted, for I do not know from this time and distance just who did get winged. There were too many, and unlike the Army, no one was awarded a Purple Heart in those days. It was a half-century in the limbo of the past, and it might be speculated that most of the patrol officers were hard-bitten Western types straight off the ranch and direct from the Texas Rangers. The truth is that more officers came from the East than the West. Some of them had never fired a gun before and had never been in any situation more desperate than an occasional school-ground fistfight. When the Border Patrol was created by an act of Congress, there was no time to stage a civil service examination and gain a backlog of potentials in the normal way. The Civil Service had just held a nationwide exam for railway postal clerks. These clerical types were all queried as to whether they wanted to go into the adventurous life of a border patrolman or elect to hang on and eventually be appointed to the postal chores. Some accepted the offer, for it meant instant employment, and these were the laddios who made up the patrol in its early years. There were a few really good men like George Parker, and to others like Jack Thomas, who had done 2 years for stealing horses under his rightful name of Frank Copeland. And when he got offer of a river patrol guard, the forerunner outfit to the Border Patrol, he thoughtfully changed his name and signed on. Jack was a ring-tailed tutor. He would fight at any odds, and one afternoon, when some enterprising contrabandito stole down the Iro behind his outstation and took a shot at Thomas in his horse corral, old Jack just saddled up his sorrel and, with the blood pouring from the bullet hole in his leg, rode after the smuggler. Thomas had a partner, Tom Isbell, who was cut from the same bolt. The pair were stationed at Piela, the word means fight, and they rode the boundary from Monument 1 west out to Mastodon, the hottest 10 miles of U.S.-Mex border along the entire 1,800 miles of frontier. This pair were honest-to-God operators. They shot first and asked questions afterward. I was always tickled pink when old Jack, who was in charge, would call in for extra hands. Gotta have an extra man or two out here tonight to plug a few gaps, he'd say over the phone. If I was one of those extra hands, I knew there would be some action. In El Paso itself, the best gunfighter was a red-headed Ranny named Cone. He had been stationed at Piela before he moved cityward, and he was just as quick on the trigger as the Thomas Isbell duo. Cool under fire, quick to shoot, and utterly remorseless, it was always a heartening thing to be assigned with him. About the headquarters was a sorry situation in many ways. Chief Horsley was a good leader. He gave his people plenty of rein, backed them strongly when there was criticism from higher up, and on occasion came down on the river when a good fight was brewing. But he had a little pipsqueak assistant named Lenincool, who was an utter failure. He was a pompous little ass, affected a Colt Police Positive in .38 caliber, a six-shooter dolled up with ivory handles. While he was his assistant to Horsley, he was exceedingly careful never to go to the river after darkness set in. He finally asked for a transfer to Alamogordo, which was 90 miles above the border and as safe as a church. He lived out the rest of his career there. We got in his place a good solid hombre named Dougie Wright. This officer was the son of an old Texas Ranger, and while he never got into any gunfights, he was a solid citizen for all that. Probably the most obnoxious wretch in the whole subdistrict was a half-breed. His father was a gringo and his mother a Mexican named Amon Tenney. He curried favor with the chief and with linen coal was a first-class stool pigeon and carefully avoided any lethal set-tos where he might get shot. His bosom buddy was an ex-schoolteacher named Toole. This jazzbo has an ambition to be a gunfighter. He was a slight of build, anemic, and actually with a chubric face and a most unaggressive way about him. For all that, he liked to pose as the veteran of innumerable fights along the Rio Grande. These people irritated me, and I had no illusions about them. There were other sturdy souls who I was happy to know and glad to work the river with. Among these was Curtis Mosley, an ex-fireman from the El Paso Fire Department, and a mining engineer named Herv, who was riding out the Great Depression in the Border Patrol, and old Bill Duvall, who afterward became my partner on a horseback station west of El Paso, as well as Bob Carr, who had done a hitch with South African rifles and was something of a mystery man. Bob replaced Duvall as my partner on the outstation. There were others, some I liked, others I had utterly no use for, and these latter were never left in any doubt as to my reaction towards them. As I've indicated, the Border Patrol was only 6 years in existence at the time I joined on, headed by a coterie of lawyers, politicians, and immigration inspectors who had little concept of what kind of firearms were needed by the members of the force. The brand new organization drew the old Colt Model 1917 45 ACP caliber. This was all hauled out of storage after World War I, and while it was perfectly satisfactory as a sidearm, it had some drawbacks too. The worst shortcoming was the fact that the gun had to be loaded with 3-round clips. The 45 ACP is an auto pistol cartridge, and if dropped in the chamber of the Model 1917 revolver, it can be fired readily enough, but it cannot be extracted, at least not by the extractor on the gun. Each empty has to be picked out by hand. The revolver was very much a secondary weapon in the gunfights along the Rio Grande. No one depended on it. Every officer, when he left BP HQs, was armed with either a rifle or a shotgun, and these were the fighting armament. Most officers, out of the meager $150 a month wages, went downtown to Momsum Dunnigan Ryan and bought a commercially made revolver. The 45 auto was not popular. Dave Scholes, who was the only officer who regularly packed the old Model 1911. I had fetched the Parker 45 into the service with me, but I shortly laid it on the shelf and bought a new service in a 4440 with a 4-inch barrel. This 6-shooter is precisely the same gun as the Model 1917, which was issued, except the commercial model was better finished, and of course the 4440 case has a rim on it and extracts quite readily. The worst boo-boo the high brass was guilty of was to accept the old Model 1917 Enfield rifle in .30-06 caliber. This old clunker had a 26-inch barrel, weighed 9.5 pounds, and was slow and clumsy to get into and out of a patrol car. All the boys, again, out of that pitifully small $150 monthly, bought their own rifles. These, almost to a man, was the Winchester Model 1907 351 auto-loading rifle. It came with a 5-shot magazine, which was wholly inadequate, so the officer bought 2 or 3 10-shot clips, and he was then ready for a whole platoon of contrabanditas. I did not buy the Winchester 351. Instead, I had my old man ship me the Remington Model 11 auto-loading 12-gauge. I lopped the barrel off to 22 inches and had J.D. Buchanan, who later worked for Frank Packmeyer, attach an extension magazine. The magazine ran right out to the muzzle and gave me 9 quick shots. We were firing old World War I shot shells, holdover from 1919, but I'd run 20 through the gun every afternoon before going on duty and be sure all functioned. The big double-aught buckshot had made bumps and dents in the paper casings. You had to be sure those humps and bumps were not such as to hang the gun when the firing grew intense. During the summer, I had gone to duty in March. I had become something of a veteran in the fun games of river warfare, but I was struck by the fact that when the smugglers shot for a while and then streamed back across the river to the sanctuary offered on the far bank, I was all too often failed to connect. It was hard to hit a running man at night, even though he may be within 50 yards. I concluded the scattergun would be infinitely more lethal. I forthwith stacked the Savage in the locker and went afield with the old Remington and its 9-shot capacity. There were 9 big pea-size leaden pellets in a load of double-aught buckshot, and this gave me a total of 81 slugs to use in influencing the situation. I found that when the firing grew really hot and the willows were being shredded around you, there was a tendency to shoot high. I think what caused this was that a fellow, in his eagerness to see the opposition, had a tendency to lift his face off the stock of the gun, and when he did this, he overshot the target. I developed a big white bandage which I wrapped around the muzzle of the old Remington. This wrapping stood a couple of inches off the top of the barrel, and I found that even on the darkest night I could always see it, even though sometimes dimly. I made a practice of holding at the other fellow's thighs, placing the bandage at the spot. I immediately noted my score shot upward. There was a railroad bridge within 100 yards of the BP HQs, and we kept our guard on it 24 hours. It fell to my lot one fine summer eve to do my 8-hour stint on the Noreste de Mexico Puente. I did not sit on the bridge, but dropped off in the river bottom and took up a stand in the willows. I had the bridge at the American end nicely silhouetted against the light of the Santa Fe Street Bridge, the main thoroughfare between the two border towns. About 9:30 p.m., a Mexican dropped off the end of the railroad bridge and commenced to work his way towards my position. I watched him, and when he was within about 30 feet, I got up and charged down on him, pistol at the ready. Just as I got within a few feet of this cholo, I caught my toe and sprawled headlong. I hung onto the pistol, but I was in one hell of a position to capture my man. This coyote was quick as a flash. He did not elect to fall atop me, but reached down and caught the revolver in both his hands. He had a grip around the cylinder, and I had tried to pull the trigger double action. I could not have done it. The grip of this bastard prevented it. I had no slightest doubt if he wrestled the revolver out of my hands. I had by this time gripped the stock with both hands. He would kill me with my own gun. I rolled over on my back, the tugging having turned me from belly down fall, and with a mighty effort pulled back both feet and kicked this chingon in the belly. He fell away, losing his grip on the revolver. When he recovered from the kick, he was turned and hightailed it for the river. I got to my feet and at a run was close behind him when he hit the water. He was nicely outlined against the lights of Juarez. I knew I had him. I somewhat deliberately took the big 44-40 in both hands and pointed at this cholo's back right over his belt. On their report, he was driven forward in the water. I cocked the revolver and waited for him to regain his feet. The last I saw of him, he was floating nicely down toward the Socorro diversion gates. It had been a narrow escape, and the next coyote I approached I was meticulous to see that I did not charge all pell-mell. It was in East El Paso. There was a curious sort of geographical entity. The Rio Grande years ago changed its channel during a high-water rampage. Instead of wandering benignly through its many crooks and bends, it suddenly cut straight across and thereby changed the channel. The resulting phenomenon was an area called Cordoba Island. The only peculiarity was that it was not an island at all. On three sides there was a channel, but no water flowed. In this old riverbed, now quite dry, the willows grew in great profusion. It was a steaming hotbed of smuggling activity. The rum runners could wade the Rio Grande in complete immunity, get onto the square mile of Mexican territory, which was Cordoba, and there await the coming of darkness. Once dusk had settled, they could enter the willow corpse and emerge on the American side, and in a thrice duck into one of the innumerable shacks which lined the bank of the now dry stream bed. It was made to order, a golden arrangement which considerably favored the liquor runners. One night, at the foot of Pedras Street, which runs slap bang into Cordoba Island, a team of patrol officers watched a gang of smugglers scramble out of the willows in the river bottom and pile their loads of liquor into an old Hudson sedan. When the cargadores turned and raced nimbly for the protection of the Mexican side of the river, three cholos piled into the old car and commenced to drive away. The BP vehicle pulled up beside the runner's vehicle, and with guns drawn, we motioned the driver to halt. The Hudson came to a stop just as I set foot on the ground. The officer, who was in the rear seat, also alighted. The driver of the government vehicle threw the door open on the left side and hit the ground. He stepped down just as a gunman sitting beside the driver of the old Hudson swung a Model 94 carbine behind the driver's head and let go at the patrol officer in front. He was struck in the head by a .38-55 bullet and fell dead. The bullet broke up his skull and a major fragment exited and by a strange coincidence struck the patrolman alighting from the back seat in the head. It did not kill him, but it knocked him unconscious. Thus, in the space of 2 heartbeats, and with only a single round, the contrabandista had knocked out 2 patrolmen and had only myself to contend with. I ran around behind the smuggler's car and opened fire. I shot the gunman through the eye, the bullet exiting through his temple. I kept right on firing and shot the driver through the kidneys. He later died. The 3rd smuggler in the back seat cautiously poked a 6-shooter over the back seat, and I got shot through the hand for his pains. By this time, I was busy reloading. The gunman, despite the fact that he had a bullet through his right eye, which had passed out through his temple, managed to pull the driver from beneath the wheel, and with him out of the way, got in the driver's seat and drove the old sedan for a couple of blocks down the street, where he crashed it into a tree. The Border Patrol in those days, as I have said, had no radio communication. I cranked up the old patrol car after loading the dead and wounded and got to a telephone and called patrol headquarters. Before the night was done, the trio, the dead and the wounded, were all rounded up. It had been a big evening. I did not feel much regrets over the loss of the patrolman. I'd never liked him much anyway. The second lad, who had picked up a jacket fragment was not seriously hurt. Nice shooting, old Chief Horsley beamed. One evening, I remember it was during the first days of December, the 3 of us were slowly tooling about the streets hard against Cordoba Island. This, in full truth, was not a smart thing to do. The houses were all built of adobe, kind of mud brick, which made wonderful structures to withstand rifle fire. If you were holed up in an adobe jackal, you could stand off an army, and by the same token, if you took up a firing position from the protection of such a building, you had a made-to-order ambuscade. To drive around hard against the Mexican border in those days was to invite getting shot up. We had turned off San Marcel and were headed for Piedras when we saw 3 hombres scurry across the ill-lighted cal ahead of us. The driver brought the patrol car to a halt and we bailed out. As we advanced, we saw the same trio dash back towards the international line and its protecting screen of ubiquitous willows. We stood at the corner, undecided what to do. About that time, the bushwhackers made up our minds for us. They came out of the shadows, and as it was brightest moonlight, I could see every man Jack had a long gun in his hands. We let them get to within 9 paces of us, and I fired the first shot. I had the old Remington with its 9-shot magazine, and I knocked down the first 2 rannies in as many shots. I then switched my attention to the other 3, who did not like the heat. They ran back into Mexico, a distance of about 60 yards, and opened fire. An interesting facet of this little exchange was that the Lobo in the lead had an old Smith & Wesson .44 Russian. Despite the fact that he had a load of my double-aught buckshot through the middle and one of his boys had hit him spang in the breastbone with a .351 slug, he dropped to his knees behind a cottonwood sapling and kept right on shooting. The .44 Russian is a single action, and this bravo had to thumb the hammer back for each shot. He got off 3 rounds before a second charge of buckshot ended his career. Quite as interesting, really, was the second gunman who had a Wesley Richards 10-gauge, loaded with Winchester high-speed No. 5 shot. We had killed him before he could touch off either barrel. A most happy circumstance, since the distance between both parties was only 9 steps. I have the Wesley Richards today, a memento of lively times long past. The cottonwood behind which the jefe of this gang of bushwhackers had taken refuge was directly in front of a window. The other side of the window was a bedroom, and the old man sleeping within was paralyzed. A most fortunate circumstance in a way, for had he raised up in justifiable fright when the shooting was at its crescendo, he might very possibly have gotten some of the buckshot which I poured at the man crouched behind the sapling. Carted down to the morgue, an examination of the leader's pockets turned up a single $10 bill. Pay for heading the ambush party. He had died pretty cheaply.